Airing on Asheville FM 103.3 LPFM in Asheville, this is The Final Straw Radio, a weekly anarchist and anti-authoritarian broadcasts and podcast emanating out of occupied Chalagi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from projects and struggles all around the world, and you can find our archives, transcripts, ways to follow us and support us at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. This week we're sharing a conversation with Rose and Crystal, two comrades involved in the struggle against the Mountain Valley Pipeline, a 304-mile, 41-inch in diameter, liquefied so-called natural gas pipeline with a possible 75-mile extension crossing many delicate waterways, slopes, and communities across Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina. This project has been off and on under construction since 2018 and was recently forced through at a federal level as a part of the debt ceiling deal by the Biden administration and the Democrats, with the Republicans. For the hour, we talk about the project, the land and water it threatens, the history of resistance, and how to get involved in stopping this mess. Just a heads up, there are some audio quality issues throughout the conversation with both guests, so if you have trouble hearing, consider checking out the upcoming transcript at our website, or meanwhile watching the YouTube with the subtitles on. You can find more from these folks resisting the MVP by searching Appalachians Against Pipelines on various social media platforms, or check the links in our show notes, where you can also find links to various interviews that we've conducted with folks from this initiative over the last 5 years. And now a couple of announcements. The channel called Political Prisoners on YouTube, linked in our show notes, has begun a series of short documentaries about Sean Swain, the first of which you can find entitled Part 1: A Visitation Dispute. Check it out. The Disability Pride Art Show aims to celebrate the rights of disabled people through the power of art. This one-day event will take place on July 30th at the vibrant venue Different World, located at 801 Haywood Road in Asheville. The show embraces the core values of acceptance and inclusivity, emphasizing the inherent worth and talents of disabled artists. Presented by DIY Abled, a local nonprofit organization, and with This Body is Worthy. Featuring a diverse lineup of 25 talented artists, writers, video artists, and dancers, the Disability Pride Art Show promises to captivate audiences with a rich variety of artistic expressions. Attendees will have the opportunity to immerse themselves in the thought-provoking documentary Disability on the Spectrum, created by local artist Priya Ray. This film sheds light on the experiences and perspectives of disabled artists, fosters greater understanding and empathy within our community. For more information, I'd consider following DIY Abled on Instagram. Finally, check our show notes for Rashid's message, but as noted last week, incarcerated revolutionary of the Intercommunal Black Panther Party, Kevin Rashid Johnson, is continuing to be denied his round of cancer treatment for prostate cancer and has been shoved in solitary confinement cell without working lights. In the show notes or at our website, you'll find contacts for prison officials in Virginia who need pressure applied to get Rashid the medical treatment that he needs and get him back outside of the dungeon that they stuck him in.
I am Crystal, she, her. I live on Stolen, Monacan, and Tutello, also eastern Montgomery County, where the Mountain Valley Pipeline is crossing through.
I'm Rose, she, her. I live in so-called West Virginia on Stolen Monacan land. I am not originally from here or Appalachia. I've been in the fight against the Mountain Valley Pipeline for over 5 years now, and have been involved in other fights against extraction like fracking. Crystal, do you want to add a little bit about your involvement before we get started?
Yeah, I guess it's been about 5 years now also, and just started monitoring it when I noticed the cut coming through near the river here, and that's what and I met somebody else. I do jail solidarity work before this, and now also, but we had a prisoner speak out, and one of the people that came to that event was from Blacksburg and got to talking, and they let me know like what that cut was, and had actually been riding the route for quite some time, taking pictures, and I got to go with them, and that's how it started for me, was just riding around from someone I met at a prisoner speak out.
So what is the Mountain Valley Pipeline? What companies are trying to build it or planning to operate it? What's it supposed to carry through where and for what market? Just all the big who, what, where, when things.
I can start maybe with like what the Mountain Valley Pipeline is, and do you want to jump in, Crystal, with some of the companies behind it?
Sure.
Great. So the Mountain Valley Pipeline is a 42-inch diameter, 300-mile long pipeline. I think just to note, 42 inches is huge for anybody who's trying to envision this. You can get in this pipe and crawl around in it. It's so big. And the pipeline is slated to begin in so-called northern West Virginia, run into so-called central Virginia, and there's a possible extension into so-called North Carolina called the Southgate extension. We're going to largely be talking about the main line, so not the Southgate extension, because they're in very different phases at this point. This pipeline is going to carry pressurized fracked natural gas through it, which will ultimately expand fracking in the whole region in northern West Virginia.
Yeah, and some of the major investors and stakeholders in this is Next Era Energy, Consolidated Edison, also known as Con Ed, Atlas Gas Ltd., and Roanoke Gas Company, which is a local gas company here that owns about 1% of this, which made it qualify for the eminent domain part. They have built a gate station here in Elliston in the part of Eastmont. They since have raised the cost to their customers to cover their ass in this terrible investment, which only hurts the working and poor folks already struggling in Roanoke with recent high rent costs and ongoing gentrification in Northwest Roanoke, which is a predominantly Black and under-resourced community and also a food desert. So it's, these people, and this is their drinking water also, that is not even taking water right now from the Roanoke River, which this project will bore under, because of forever chemicals were found in it a couple months ago. So it's all it's just all madness. And to add this pipeline in, like, there's already enough bullshit happening, and recently, after they got this stamp of approval from Biden, basically they have said that now they're only going to run this at 35% capacity. So, the whole idea was for national energy security and how we need this so bad. And now they come out after they get everything that they want. Now they're saying they're only going to maybe run it at 35%. So how bad is it really needed to tear up everything for 35%?
Yeah, and I think just to be like totally clear, we know that projects like this don't meet a need for natural gas and fossil fuels. They actually create the demand. So I think that's an important thing that Crystal is getting at. And yeah, when we're just talking about this 300-mile long route, which is quite extensive, we're also talking about fracking, which for folks who aren't familiar with that process, it's an incredibly toxic extractive process where really toxic chemicals are pumped into the ground to crack shale that releases natural gas. We don't know what's in those chemicals. There's all kinds of reports of people getting really sick in the frack fields, water being poisoned, air quality being terrible. So we're not only talking about this pipeline, we're talking about expanding fossil fuel extraction in general and just sort of being pushed further into climate chaos.
And if I can add on to that, in the 1st of October, I got to go to the Gulf Coast and meet with the Port Arthur. John Beard is the person with that. Can't think of the name of it, but also Rise St. James with Sharon Levine in Louisiana, and got to see all the new export facilities being built there. And these folks they're already burdened, like waking up at 6:30 in the morning with a headache and using my inhaler because the air quality. We're crying now about the smoke that's hitting us here, and how bad it is. And these people live this every day, and they are actively constructing like 10 export facilities, which wasn't even a thing until 2015, and Obama lifted that, from what I learned down there. So yeah, it's just contributing to Cancer Alley.
Sounds like the EPA just dropped a lawsuit concerning the impacts of dropped as in pulled back from like a civil rights claim around Cancer Alley and cancer levels among residents there. Between the fires and what you're talking about, the like actual flow of gas and export of these things, and also the water pollution, it's like it just really shows the fundamentally global level of the impacts of these sort of things. Would you mind saying a few things about the like terminology of natural gas? Because that's how it's marketed and that's how it's talked about. We can talk about it like LNG or liquefied natural gas, but there's like a weird framing to that term as the industry has gotten that phrase to be normalized.
I think it's a really good point that natural gas sounds like maybe something that's a little bit cleaner and greener, and that is what they've tried to market since the fracking boom, right? And just to be clear, things have really changed in the last like 10 or 20 years when it comes to fracking. There's new technology that makes it more dangerous than it's ever been, especially with the horizontal drilling that happens in the fracking process. And I think there was sort of this discovery that maybe we could access, and by we, I mean, people in the extraction industry could access more natural gas than they could before with the development of this new technology like horizontal drilling and the sort of slew of toxic chemicals that, again, are protected by trade secrets. So we don't actually know what's in that sort of toxic mix. But I think there's always been this idea since that fracking boom that natural gas could be this sort of bridge fuel for us as we've moved away, or as we are like, quote unquote, moving away from coal. And I say quote unquote because they are still expanding coal and mountaintop removal mining for coal in Appalachia, in West Virginia, I'm sure in other places too. But there's this imagined idea that natural gas is going to be a safe way to help us move away from fossil fuels. And I think the marketing of calling it natural sort of helps frame that imaginary idea. And I think it's clear, like you mentioned, the fires, Crystal's talking about what's happening in the Gulf. It's clear that there's not actually time for that. There's not time for us to be really invested in some kind of bridge fuel with the rate of climate change. Crystal, do you want to jump in on any of that?
Well, no, because I think you know much more about that. As you know, I've just entered this fight not as an environmentalist, but just something that was basically in my backyard. So I've learned a whole lot since this. Like, they recycled the frack gas by putting it down on the roads before it snows, which just makes me cringe, because I think about all the deer and the wildlife that like you see on the side of the road licking that after a snowfall or whatever. And yeah, those are things I never knew, that we just don't know. They call it brine, but it's really fracked wastewater recycled or whatever. And it's pretty disgusting. And we have tributaries and little, like, we're at the bottom of mountains, so we have water everywhere. And there's so many unnamed waters, but this stuff just runs, this recycled frack gas blasting wastewater is being pawned off on, unsuspecting people like me who just think, oh, that's great, they're going to keep the roads clear, when it snows. And really, I would just rather not, if that's what we're going to use. So that's my rant about the frack gas industry.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. The waste that comes from the fracking process, because a certain amount of the chemicals are sort of sucked back up after, and a lot of them end up in injection wells, which are exactly what they sound like, just wells of frack waste in the ground. Like Crystal said, this stuff ends up on the side of the road, and we're talking about a product that people are calling natural gas. Meanwhile, there's it's generating radioactive waste. So I think it's a really good point that they've really tried to market this in a way that makes it sound like it's so much better, and it technically does burn cleaner than coal, which is how they've been able to do that. And I think that a campaign has certainly been launched against coal, and the amount of coal that's burning is on the decline, but natural gas just isn't a solution.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that in these sort of competition between different methods of, in a lot of cases, creating electricity for consumers or industry, that the motivations, like, they're not just based on pure science, they're not just based on what's going to cause the least amount of damage to whatever environments they're passing through or if they're pulled from or where they're being burned, as much as these, like, in some cases, probably some of the same companies like Peabody or whatever are also involved and have their fingers in things like liquefied natural gas throughout the transition process. And it's not so much like ending one process, as you say, like there's still a lot of power plants around the country that burn coal and it's coming from somewhere, as much as it is just industries finding new markets and ways to, with federal subsidies, extract that stuff. And Crystal, I had no idea about the brine solution that was used in some places to halt freezing of roads. I kind of like, I had heard of that happening. I didn't know if that was just like salt water from the coast or if that was, I had heard like in some places, like in the Midwest, they'll use, I guess, salts from like sugar beets, I think, as like a byproduct of that. But yeah, I had no idea. That's wacky and scary.
It's so gross. And it's not in every state. I don't think it's legal in Virginia, but Pennsylvania, like there's some states that do have it. I don't think we're actually doing it here, but it's still a thing, you know. Like everything runs down this way into another river. It's all heading to the Gulf.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. There have already been years of struggle in a few different forms that have led to what seemed like an end to the Mountain Valley Pipeline, or MVB project. Like, people have been resisting on site and at corporate headquarters and all over the place. I wonder if you all wouldn't mind talking a little bit about some of the phases of those struggles and also what pipe was laid by these companies.
Well, I can say that, people have been fighting the pipeline since it was proposed and all the ways through conventional channels like courts, going to meetings, writing letters, lobbying, grassroots organizing, and people have been taking direct action since construction began in 2018. I don't know if, Rose, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
I know y'all have interviewed some folks throughout the direct action campaign, especially from Yellowfinch, which I can talk a little bit about, and I'm sure Crystal can talk a little bit about as well. But the start of the direct action campaign happened in the so-called Jefferson National Forest in the beginning of 2018 on Peters Mountain. This is a really important, beloved mountain to this fight. The Appalachian Trail runs across the top of it. It's of incredible ecological importance, but also just very important to the surrounding community. And I think MVP sort of came for that mountain as one of the first places because they knew that, and folks were in the trees along the Appalachian Trail to stop them. So 2 tree sits along the Appalachian Trail stopped construction up there for 95 days. They were reinforced with other blockades further down the road, including a monopod blockade and a skypod blockade. And later that year, MVP actually lost their permits to go through the Jefferson National Forest. So if it wasn't for folks helping stop construction in that forest, pipe may have already been laid there. And I think in a little bit, we can talk more about what the landscape of that looks like now. But until very recently, they still didn't have those permits to go through the national forest. They had been twice revoked. So after 2018, the direct action campaign has continued for over 5 years, and dozens of people have put their bodies on the line to stop the pipeline. There's been some really creative blockades, like a local grandmother, Becky Crabtree, who locked herself in her first ever car, a Ford Pinto, to stop construction at her farm. And in summer of 2021, 3 self-described old folks locked themselves to a car blockade to stop access on an access road. There have been people who have locked themselves to giant wooden animals that are found in the area. And also, of course, one of the longest lasting blockade, or the longest lasting blockade of the campaign, it was the Yellowfinch tree sits, which were outside of Elliston, Virginia, for 2.5 years, protecting some of the last remaining trees on the route.
I just wanted to add, like, there's been college professors. I mean, there's been raging grannies. There's been young folks. Just so many people from different walks of life have, stepped up and definitely put their body on the line and had to deal with, just the courts and all that mess. Yellowfinch is probably, like, I feel like if around and find out was like really should be in the dictionary, it should be the yellowfinch tree sits, because I think them leaving those tree sits up for 932 days, there was a community built amongst people that would probably have never talked in everyday life, or if it was this fight against the Mountain Valley Pipeline. And that space allowed for like a lot of good conversations, a lot of learning about each other and how much we really do have in common. And I think that's what's kind of made this movement so, I think, strong when it comes down to it, and resilient and determined, and has shown grit all the way around, is just from really the yellowfinch tree sits. It just taught us all a whole lot about a lot of things, and in a magnificent, beautiful way. And that is something that can never be taken back. And so, yeah, that should be the definition for around and find out. That's what I'm going to say about yellowfinch.
Yeah, I definitely agree. So all of these tactics, in conjunction with the legal challenges, really have successfully stalled this pipeline for over 5 years. The original completion date was the end of 2018. Now it's 2023. They say they'd like to finish it by the end of the year. We're going to stop them from finishing it by the end of the year. But I think it is important to just like acknowledge all the work that has gone in to get us to this point, for sure. There is a lot of pipe in the ground right now, but there's a lot of areas left. We just learned they had 643 water crossings at least. They had always said they were halfway done, but now we know there's probably over 643. There's the National Forest, like I was talking about, and Peters Mountain. There's a lot of really challenging terrain for them to cross still.
So I know that for the companies involved, and it's okay if you don't have an answer to this, but like between these and other methods that people had of slowing the process, the companies that have been involved in this have lost millions of at least potential dollars that they were going to be earning off of this at every step of the way. Is that like, are these companies just kind of there's no bottom to their pockets, or are they getting a bunch of federal subsidy or state subsidies to cover the cost of like lost potential profits due to the weight they've had to make to try to build this project out?
I would love to know. There's maybe Rose knows, but I do want to just point out that this project was like a little bit over 3 billion originally, and now they're up to 6 billion.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of the investors had capped their investments. I think MVP still really could be in financial trouble, is my opinion. And I don't know about federal subsidies, but I do think they have been in very serious debt from this project for a long time, and the investors have been very unhappy. And personally, I find a little bit of hope in that.
Yeah, for real. I had been under the impression before this conversation that the project had actually been canceled, and I think I was slightly mixing it up with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, the ACP, because they were both going to be built, or planned to be built, proposed to be built in the same general region, and around there was a lot of resistance going around to both the projects at the same time, even though they covered different terrains. But so yeah, do a lot of people kind of work off of that same presumption that the MVP was canceled? And is that a conversation that you've been having a lot recently?
I've had people in my community talk about that they had thought that it had gotten canceled. So yes, and and even with some of the court rulings, it's all very confusing. Like I'm a single mom, and I work a regular job during the week and stuff. And to keep up with all this mess, the only reason I'm able to do that is because I've found myself in a space with other, like the yellowfinch tree sits. I've gotten to meet other people who can look into these things better, direct me to where I need to be, paying attention. But not everybody has that, because you just hear what's on the local news or whatever. So yeah, there's been a lot of misconceptions that this pipeline was canceled, and it really should be. And it was attached to that national debt ceiling. And I don't know if we're going to talk about that any, but I think it's important to know that this company had court hearings, they had lost permits, and after it was signed to that debt ceiling, they have no judicial rule now. We don't even know if we get violations, which we will, because that's what happened in 2018 when they were actively working. We're not even sure, can they even get in trouble for it? Like, they have free range right now to do whatever they want to do. And that's scary and should be alarming for anybody.
I think that this is important to mention because before Congress essentially bailed out this pipeline project, they were in serious financial trouble, like we've mentioned, billions of dollars in debt, and they were still tied up in court. Earlier this year, they lost an important permit to cross state waterways in West Virginia, which impacted their federal permit to cross all waterways. And it was unclear whether they would be able to finish this pipeline by the end of this year or at all. So in a lot of ways, it felt like this fight was really being won. And I think a lot of people assumed they never were going to build it based on how that direction was going. And there also hasn't been any construction since the fall of 2021. So I think locally people are looking at the project and seeing that and thinking that probably it's over. So it is an important conversation to be having, and just the distinction, like more regionally and nationally, with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was canceled and far less of that pipe is in the ground. It's definitely a separate set of circumstances. We were sort of just on hold here, thinking that it was likely that it might not go based on how badly things were going for MVP, if that makes sense.
And definitely didn't think they would be working this summer, because it would have taken that long for them to get that permit back from West Virginia to rewrite all that stuff. And, so yeah, definitely wasn't expecting this at all.
Because it's part of that package that's been signed, I guess it supersedes at a federal level all the local challenges, and the executive has, which the EPA falls under, has decided not to pursue blocking it anymore due to the debt ceiling agreement. Is that right? Is that an okay way of looking at it?
Yeah, I think to just be really clear about what this new law says that was sort of slid into the debt ceiling deal. This new law mandated that they get all of their permits back within 21 days of the law being passed, which they did just a few days ago. So I don't know that there was any recourse for the other agencies involved. It was just like, the law is, now you get your permits. And I think Crystal was sort of mentioning this earlier, but a really scary thing about the law is that now there's no legal challenges, right? Like these ways that have been really successful in slowing the pipeline in conjunction with like protests at headquarters, like you said, and people doing direct action on the ground. This important channel for challenging the pipeline, slowing the pipeline, stopping the pipeline has been taken away. The new law says you can't challenge permits or the pipeline at all, really. You can only challenge this law in a specific court. So you'd have to challenge the law as a whole. And I think that's a way to legalize environmental violations and throw all regulation as far as these things go to the wind. And I think a lot of us are not surprised that this has happened, but it is just a very extreme way to show the power that the fossil fuel industry has and how the state will essentially do anything to save them when they're floundering, right? Like, this was a failing project, and I can't really imagine another way they could have been saved other than this. And I think if there's any clear ways that are like the state and the fossil fuel industries are, together in that way, this is just a really classic example and very extreme one.
Besides the pushing through of this through that federal agreement, the landscape has changed in terms of the repercussions for people engaging in actions concerning what's considered to be like vital infrastructure, since not only since the resistance at Standing Rock, but also and MVP, ACP, Low Levy, and other like anti-pipeline struggles, but also since the George Floyd uprising. I know a number of states have passed new laws threatening extra charges or advanced charges against people that are doing civil disobedience or direct action as relates to what's considered public infrastructure projects, despite whether those are like activities that would harm people or not. I wonder if you have anything to say about that, or if that's a thing that seems like it would affect this and like the legal needs for like support infrastructure for folks that are going to be trying to stop the MVP from spreading.
I can certainly talk a little bit about repression that has happened in the past and maybe whether or not that's a sign of what will happen in the future. Folks have, we've been fighting this pipeline through direct action for over 5 years, and folks have definitely caught some very serious charges, right? People have had felonies, people have had threats of terrorism charges. A felony has never stuck in the campaign, so all of those felonies have been thrown out. But the state has definitely tried to throw all kinds of bullshit at people, and I think it's really impressive that people have continued to fight in the face of that repression and had some real consequences. The final yellowfinch tree sitters that were extracted from those tree sits each spent months in jail. There was a really vibrant community that wrote letters and showed their support, and I think we hope to not see that kind of state repression in the future, but we know that it is certainly possible just based on what they've done in the past, and think, there could certainly be a time of need for support.
I'll just say, like, that Threats of Terrorism Act is, so I stayed up in a tree for 3 days at Yellowfinch myself. And one of the main reasons I did that was because it really pissed me off that they charge, or were going to try to charge, to folks with that threats of terrorism. And I think, I'm a grandmother, I clean houses locally. And it was, I think that was in solidarity, like, okay, then arrest me too with a terrorist charge, because what they're doing is not a terrorist charge. We had a local insurrectionist from the January 6th event who was out on bond the next morning. And the two that got arrested for the tree sits, they never were bonded out. I don't even think they ever got a bond. I'm pretty sure they did not get a bond, and got extra time that took off from their good time. So when we're talking about repression, it's always a certain group that is getting that, and more of us have to be brave and stand in solidarity now more than ever, and just trust the people that we're around that are going to have our backs also. I think we're talking about being scared. Well, I'm speaking on myself personally, being scared of what charges they may throw coming forward or whatever. And I deal with that myself, and how I can make sure that I'm being supportive in all the ways, as not just a grandmother, but as a local community person who is now like going to have to start going to the board meetings again of the supervisor board meetings here locally, to make sure that folks within a mile of this pipeline know the evacuation route. Where is that? Who do they call when they see things going bad, or there's not even an odorant in this pipeline, so they wouldn't even know if it's leaking. We live next to train tracks, and interstate, and if it is leaking, anything can spark that. This is going to be a catastrophe. They have so many landslides already by looking that information up on their FERC docket. So I think protecting people can be scary, but it's the humane thing to do.
Yeah, and I just want to acknowledge as we're having this conversation about repression that a lot of folks over the years have put their bodies on the line in the path of this pipeline to risk arrest. And we know that risking arrest in that way does require a certain degree of privilege for many folks. And this is why it's so important to us as people that don't think pipelines should exist, but also think that prisons should exist, to engage in prisoner support work and jail solidarity work and abolitionist work. So I just want to throw that in as we're having this conversation. And I know Crystal and I are both engaged with some of that work.
One day we'll rise up, build the world we had in mind. One day they'll arrest us for standing for what's right. It's not the jail time that I mind, it's the injustice found inside. Someday the system's gonna burn. Up on the Blue Ridge Mountains is where I made my stand. Up on the Blue Ridge Mountains is where I made my stand. With a tree sit up this oak tree and a guitar in my hand. Another No More Pipeline song. MVP and police can't climb a hill so steep. MVP and police gonna wreck a crane, you'll see. Whenever they come get me, I'll be sitting in this tall oak tree. Don't they know the pipeline's doomed? Locals and LOs look kindly after me. Locals and LOs look kindly after me. We stand in solidarity with Land Back and Line 3. There's strength in unity. Birds, squirrels, and insects come hang out in our trees. Frost thawed and new growth and fresh budding spring leaves. They will rip up the forest and force the rocks to bleed. Free the land from corporate greed. One day we'll rise up, build the world we had in mind. One day they'll arrest us for standing for what's right. It's not the jail time that I mind, it's the injustice found inside. Someday the system's gonna burn.
The Final Straw is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts, and here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
I'm going to make those pompous academics regret kicking out such a genius. Deciding to build my lab and do my research.
The Time Talks Podcast.
Have you ever stared at a 500-page book and wish you could just talk to the author about their ideas instead? If so, the Time Talks Podcast, part of the Channel Zero network, is for you, where we discuss history, politics, music, and art with an anti-authoritarian and anarchist perspective.
The Time Talks Podcast.
What's this light? I feel different.
The Time Talks Podcast.
So Southern and Central Appalachia have historically been zones of extraction under settler colonial USA. I mean, not unlike the rest of Turtle Island, right, or so-called North America, but they've been a source for coal, for timber, and for other raw materials to be removed at great human and natural cost and leaving behind devastation for short-term profit for a few. Can you speak about the Mountain Valley Pipeline in this legacy of devastating the landscape for extraction and the sort of resistance that people put up to it in that manner?
I can start on that. So, like you mentioned, there is this long history of outsiders coming in and profiting off of Appalachia's resources and leaving a slew of environmental and social and economic devastation in its wake. And I think we've seen this in a variety of ways. I think the coal fields and areas where mountaintop removal is active are really good examples. There are so many issues in those areas that can be traced back to the coal industry: undrinkable water and terrible air quality and high cancer rates and the opioid epidemic and unemployment. And like I said before, I just want to acknowledge that that is still happening. I think there's this idea that coal is really on the decline, but new MTR permits are being issued and mines are expanding. And I think that is definitely an area that feels like a sacrifice zone to a lot of people. And I think there's a long history of this since colonization, like you said, of people in Appalachia and land in Appalachia being expendable, like the Battle of Blair Mountain. We're talking about the National Guard dropping bombs on striking workers. So I think the state and industry in collusion with each other, just feeling like this area doesn't matter and the people in this area don't matter. And I think, once again, with this recent debt ceiling deal, we're seeing this with the MVP. It just seems like Appalachia feels like a sacrifice zone, right? This is the thing that the Democrats and the politicians were willing to sacrifice so that they could pass this law. And I think this goes all the way back to last summer when they passed the Inflation Reduction Act, right? The Dems cut this side deal with Joe Manchin, who this seems to be his pet project, and he also seems to get whatever he wants. So they cut this side deal so that they could pass this supposedly great environmental legislation, and this was what they were willing to sacrifice, and they tried to slide it into all other kinds of laws since then, and it didn't work because people were fighting back. But the debt ceiling deal, with potential economic collapse on the horizon, this is how they finally got it through. And I think Appalachia is going to see very few profits from this, right? Like, everyone talks about all the jobs that a pipeline is supposed to bring, and that just isn't real. Like, we see who comes here to work on this pipeline. Maybe local folks get to work for private security, but there are not people here who are getting good jobs from this pipeline, right? Not that that's the only thing that matters here, but I think there's just very clear collaboration between the state and these huge corporations to force this hazardous project through an area that doesn't need it, and most of which doesn't want it either.
Yeah, I think the local job line is a bunch of bullshit because all these cars are from out of town, all these trucks. And also, like, maybe waitresses are making a little bit of more money now with tips or being busier. But, a friend at the gas station who's now not getting as a longer break because they're busier now, she's still making the same bullshit wages. Like, it's not like she's making more money there. So this isn't a long, sustainable income for this community, this region. And that's what folks really do need, is some better ideas other than this.
Yeah, it seems comparable to the conversation of when governments, like local governments, are talking about building a new prison or whatever. It can bring, like, it might create jobs for members of the local community for construction, but probably a lot of them aren't going to get the as terrible as a job as being a guard is, or whatever, working administration at a prison. That promise is just kind of dangled there, and it's not even usually fulfilled in that manner. And it does kind of bleed over into, like, hotels and other service industry, like you mentioned. But also there's a lot of other negative consequences besides the environmental, like man camps that are related to the building of extractive facilities oftentimes create a scenario where there's an uptick in violence, an uptick in misogynist and sexual violence in a lot of cases.
Well, and just displacing local people because they bring their RVs here. And I've already have a friend who can't find a place to park her RV, which she lives out of. That was her retirement thing for herself. And she's staying with her daughter because all the spaces around here are booked up to pipeliners. So they displace people too. And rent around here is so hard right now. I'm sure rent prices are up everywhere, but especially in this area. And so any available spaces are also now being taken up by these out-of-towners. And if I can just add on about long-term jobs, I don't know if it's like a plug or whatever. I have not read this book yet, but was in a Zoom meeting with them, and it's Cold Cage's Crisis. And the thing that I was a part of for a short time was talking about how in these communities they are building a lot of jails as kind of the new economy. Like, they give seniors in high school like $1,000 bonus to, like, join their CO class or whatever. And that's pretty gross. Like, we shouldn't be building more jails and prisons to make the economy a better place, like sustainable, real jobs, real investment. And we know the money's out there. It's just they don't want to in this area. And as always, we're going to fight this pipeline. We're going to have to fight for everything for us in this area, and that's jobs, a future, community, all that.
That's a really important way to highlight the way we see this pipeline and all fossil fuel extracted industry just really tied to all these other issues and movements to be fighting prisons, extraction, patriarchy, white supremacy, borders, capitalism, all of the bad things. So again, it really is about so much more than a pipeline for us.
So assuming that capitalists' hope was that this would catch activists and communities unaware, that they could just restart it and folks wouldn't be able to organize themselves, can you talk a bit about the work of reinvigorating the resistance, this project that has been on hold for a couple of years if the last construction was happening in 2021? What does the process of re-energizing this look like?
I think the energy is out there. I'm just speaking from what I've seen. We had a rally in DC in front of the White House and rode a bus from this area there and got the news on the bus that they were given their 404 permit. And these are people who have done everything the right way, quote unquote, the right way. And I heard people say the only thing that's left is civil disobedience, and never thought I would hear some of these folks ever say that. So by them attaching this to this national debt ceiling, I think has energized a certain group of people who really, really believed, that locking to equipment wasn't their first choice. It was definitely doing the lobbying and all that stuff. So yeah, I think by Biden basically fucking us has definitely re-energized some people, but I'll let Rose talk more about what they're hearing.
I mean, I think similarly, a lot of people are just really fired up locally, regionally, but also nationally, right? Through this whole process of MVP being this side deal with Manchin. I think it also helps the people who are so pissed at Joe Manchin, right? Like suddenly this pipeline has caught national attention because the way this has gone down is so f***ed up. And I think for some folks, like Crystal was saying, it is really a wake-up call to the reality that this system that we have, the courts, the state are not going to save us from these fossil fuel pipelines or from projects like this that are trying to be forced through communities. And I think a lot of people are seeing that we're going to have to stop this ourselves. And I think it's just an important time to be reminding everyone that this is not over, that the courts were not the only way that this pipeline was being stalled for all these years.
Yeah, and I would just say, like, on my end is just trying to make space for everyone to be involved, like water monitoring, work site training, monitoring, which resulted back in 2018 in the MVP being fined $2.15 million for over 300 violations, which those were pictures taken by local people and submitting them. They still have, over the 600 water bodies, which just a couple of weeks ago, it was only like 400 in some water bodies. So that was a lie. And now that they got their permits, they're like, oh yeah, now it's over 600, including the Greenbrier River in West Virginia. And I think there's something special about that. Maybe Rose can say, I think like it's never been messed with or bored under, and it's also pretty huge. But 75% of this route is through moderately high or high risk landslide risk areas, which have slid since not even while they're doing construction. This is just from, in places that they've already buried pipe. And I think the real danger of this thing blowing up, people know that the damage to people's lives, like us stopping this pipeline is about saving people's lives also.
Yeah, and I think to your point on the rivers, the Greenbrier is definitely a crucial, like really amazing, beautiful river. It's one of the only undammed rivers in the country. Their original plan was to dam a lot of these rivers to put the pipeline through. Now they're going to drill under all the rivers. But again, we're talking about putting a 42-inch pipeline under a major river. And I think it doesn't take an ecologist or a biologist or a scientist to think through that and know that this is just a wildly terrible idea. A lot of the terrain also around here is karst terrain, which makes it in part susceptible to landslides. But just for folks who don't know, karst basically means that the ground is filled with caves and is also susceptible to sinkholes. And the idea that there's going to be a pipe in this area that is susceptible to sinkholes just feels so dangerous. I think if there had been gas running through this pipeline, it would have already exploded. And that feels important to note.
And let's talk about the earthquakes that we've had here recently. Like, we've had a couple lower magnitude earthquakes, but they're still like 2.5, 2.8. You know, that's still, that's sketchy. One just recently.
Yeah, I was driving through the area that y'all are talking about not that long ago, like I don't know, like 6-7 months ago, and noted a lot of pipeline just kind of like sitting stacked up in fields without tarps on it or anything like that. Like, in the meantime, while this project's been on hold, I don't know if that was MVP stuff that was just sitting and waiting, but is that a concern in terms of the safety of delivery, that the method, like, while this has been on pause, how have the pieces of pipe and the fittings and all these things been being stored? Is that a thing you can speak to? And is that a concern?
I can say it's a huge concern. And just a couple days ago, the Mountain Valley Pipeline responded to that concerns with a letter to FERC. And it was like 382 pages. So I have not read it yet because, again, who has time? Like, they can't make it simple. But their response was, yeah, it was 382 pages and just going over our response. But yeah, or their response to our concerns. But it is chipping. There are raccoons living in this pipeline. The epoxy coating is peeling off of it. We've all taken pictures of that. These pipes were supposed to have been rotated. That's a big lie. It has not happened. So that is a real concern. And apparently there's not much that FISMA, I always say their name wrong, the PHMSA, they won't even do anything until after an incident happens. So yeah.
And just to note, years ago when they were like, we got to get this pipeline in the ground, right? Because this started in 2018. So this pipe has literally been sitting out for almost 6 years, if not longer. They were like, oh, the pipe can't sit out, so we have to get it in the ground as fast as possible. And now, years and years later, people are like, what about the pipe that's been sitting out? And they're like, oh, it's fine. Don't worry about it.
So we've kind of talked about some of the like local fears of what might come out of this if the pipeline is built. Does anyone have stats or information concerning the wider impact outside of the area where the pipeline is? Like Crystal was talking about what's going on in Cancer Alley.
I would say there's already people who don't have drinking water in their house right now because of this pipeline. I don't know if that's an answer, and it's not even built, but I'll let Rose go and I'll see what they say.
Definitely outside of what's going to happen locally. And I think we could probably talk for another hour about what's going to happen locally if this pipeline is built, for sure. But we do know that this pipeline is the equivalent to 26 coal-fired power plants. So just back to our conversation about natural gas and the marketing of natural gas and how it seems like it's so much better than coal. These are the carbon emissions that we're talking about. And I think that that's huge when we're thinking about climate change and the really serious impacts that we're all already seeing. I mean, I imagine anyone listening to this right now can look out their window and be seeing smog from these wildfires. And I think the way this is going to contribute to climate change is really serious and needs to be considered, and clearly wasn't considered as we're talking about, like, oh, Congress passed this great environmental legislation, but what were they willing to offer? This pipeline that's going to just make everything worse.
Yeah, and I'll add that it's also like adding 19 million new cars a year. And just also recently, now that this is within the last 2 days, James Martin, the PhD chief of Gas Branch 3 Division of Gas, Environment, and Engineering, wrote in a letter that Mountain Valley has estimated that over the operational life of the project, up to 247.68 acres of trees associated with potential future slips, that's what they call landslides, slips, may need to be cleared. Additionally, there are potentially impacts from future vegetation maintenance during operation. Because of these factors, Mountain Valley has determined that the project is likely to adversely affect the tricolored bat. FERC agrees with the analysis and conclusion of the biological assessment. So that's another thing with the endangered species. They're like, no, it won't be affected. But now that they've gotten all their permits, just like the over 600 waterways now they're like, oh yeah, and we're probably going to have to take, deforest another 300 acres. Oh, and that bat, yeah, that's probably going to get too. So it's bullshit. It's all coming to light now. Things that we already knew, but like now they're just saying it. Yeah, I was just going to add that we really don't know what the future outcome of how much more it's going to damage things is going to be, because we're like, it's ongoing. We can't really say. We know it's going to be a lot, but probably more than what we think.
Yes, for sure. And, as we see this project as a continuation of colonization and are, again, not just fighting for this pipeline, but for land back to Indigenous people, it does feel important to note that the South Gate extension of this pipeline is slated to go through Lumbee territory, and there's been a lot of Indigenous resistance to that section in particular, for sure. So just want to plug that piece as well, because it's important.
So how can people that are interested in learning more and maybe getting involved in the resistance to the resumption of the Mountain Valley Pipeline construction get involved and learn more, and what sort of work is needed either locally or remotely?
Yeah, I think construction on this pipeline, since the debt ceiling deal, it has started. The landscape suddenly looks very different. They are moving equipment. There are workers around everywhere. It's happening. It's very overwhelming. It's very scary. And we are definitely calling for people in this moment to come help us fight this pipeline on the ground. Stop them at these waterways. Stop them in the national forest. Stop them from coming through these mountains. So one way you can do that is to get in touch with us at Appalachians Against Pipelines at protonmail.com. And yeah, if folks who can't make it, solidarity actions where you are. There are, Crystal, do you have ways folks can see the lists of investors, or is that posted somewhere easily accessible?
I know Third Act, which is a group of 60 and older elders who have been kind of giving the banks hell and, getting arrested in the banks, sitting in. They're probably a good place to look at some good banks. Wells Fargo seems to be the main choice. I think it's the top investor in this project, or is that correct, Rose? Do you know?
I don't think they're the top investor, but I think they're heavily, for sure. But yeah, definitely doing solidarity actions wherever you can in your own communities, and just spreading the word about what's happening here feels really important right now.
We did have some banner drops a couple weeks ago when we knew this was going through, right after the debt ceiling was signed, and Richmond, North Carolina, Virginia. They the hashtag was Save Appalachia and Stop MVP. So, folks, if you want to get creative and drop a banner somewhere, that'd be awesome, and share those pictures so we can see them.
We're also on social media, Appalachians Against Pipelines. It's on Facebook, it's on Instagram, it's on Twitter.
I'd love to hear more about this. That, obviously this struggle is not, it is local to the area where the pipeline is being constructed, and the implications of it are global, but so is the network of corporations that are involved in the construction of this, the government agencies and individual politicians that are pushing this through. And also
struggles, localized struggles like this are going on in all sorts of places that have these intermeshing. Some of the same corporations that are involved in this are probably involved in pushing for the construction of Cop City, just south of so-called Atlanta. I wonder if y'all could talk about the place that the struggle against the Mountain Valley Pipeline sits in relation to other struggles against ecocide.
I'll just say that the Stop Cop City is, I feel horrible for what's going on down there with Tortuguita and their mom. I was listening to her speak earlier on their last day of action down there, and yeah, just that's just a horrible situation, and I hope that's nothing that we face here. And but it that definitely has my heart hurting and also nervous about what, like, I hate to be Debbie Downer, but just what's happening down there with they killed that young person, and that's nothing I hope ever happens again, ever. I don't know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I think also just thinking about Indigenous-led resistance everywhere to similar projects like this. You know, we think about Coastal GasLink pipeline that's trying to be forced through Wet'suwet'en land, and it's really important to be engaged and struggle against all projects like this. But if you can't travel, doing something in your own communities is important, and not just pipelines or so-called environmental work, right? Fighting against the prisons and the expansion of the police, or the existence of the police rather, and all of the things is really important.
Well, Crystal and Rose, unless you wanted to say anything else, I really appreciate you having this conversation and the work that you're doing, and taking the time to be in touch with me and answer these questions.
I think it's great. I appreciate you for willing to talk with us and help us get this fight out, because it's going to take a lot. It's going to take a lot. And to give some people even some rest, we've done great, but I'm telling you folks, if I fear for I know the summer is going to be long, is what I feel. And they're working today. So they're working on a Saturday. So this is going to be gun ho. They're going to be gun ho, talking because they know there's nothing that can be done. And it kind of makes me feel like the action with the helicopter. They had flown a helicopter forever trying to, and I'm sorry if this is just going on, but to tell you, one of my favorite actions was the helicopter. They were seeding these hills, which the grass still hasn't grown because they threw seed down on like black tarp, and I have pictures of that also. But people were messaging me, and like they flew this helicopter for weeks, and in some places 2 helicopters, and I have pictures of that, of them loading side by side. It's constant noise. It's draining on people. People are having to give their dogs anxiety pills now. That's crazy. And when that day that someone had locked down to the helicopter, I remember feeling so good, like, yeah, your helicopter, not today, and that's what the feeling I want to go into this summer feeling is like, just some of that empowerment, like you're driving us insane and we're going to do the same for you today. So just getting in the way.
I got a big smile just hearing you say that. That's great. Your helicopter, and we're going to be in the way.
Yeah, and just being able to get on the security's nerves because they act all big and bad. And I remember just telling the security, like, so you just let someone run by you and lock down to a helicopter? Like, what kind of job are you doing? Just ragging on them for letting somebody lock down to a helicopter, which, was also a lot of bullshit. And what they were fined, I think, a good amount of money. And that helicopter was back up the next day. There was nothing wrong with the helicopter, got pictures of the helicopter. But that day, they also chose to try to have a drone war with somebody on our side had a drone up. And there's video of that on Appalachians Against Pipelines, where I don't know if it was MVP or if it was the state police, but they were definitely going after the drone that was up in the air, making sure that the person on the helicopter was okay. So it was an eventful day, but it was probably one of my most memorable actions.
And now some words from Anarchist prisoner Sean Swain.
France is on fire, and none too soon, I might add. Just my humble opinion, but it's never too late to burn down a nation state. And that goes for nation states south of Canada and north of Mexico, too. As I write this, the population of France is wilding out after 4 days of protests. Over 13,000 people have been arrested, and the government is running out of places to put them. The nation's jail system has had to quadruple its expenditures on breakfast croissants just to feed the rioters. Okay, no, I made that up. I have no information regarding breakfast croissants in French jails. But all of this stems from a police shooting of a 17-year-old during a traffic stop on June 27th. Nahel, as the teen has been identified, was from a family originating in Algeria and was stopped by French police in Nanterre, a west suburb of Paris. The officer involved in the shooting was criminally charged. Still enraged, the French rebels took to the streets, burning cop cars, clashing with cops, and appropriating goods from capitalists in a wave of what the media has termed vandalism, arson, and looting. Rebels in Marseille raided a gun shop and stole all the guns. Nahel was the fourth death caused by French police this year, becoming a flashpoint for insurrection. It appears that the French are really serious about opposing police violence when you consider that 13 people were killed by cops in all of last year. American cops, in comparison, have a quota to kill more people than that each day before their first box of donuts in the morning. Their first box of donuts. France's national soccer team, very influential among the youth, had released a statement pleading to end the violence. It reads in part, "Violence resolves nothing. There are other peaceful and constructive ways to express yourself." Seems to me the French national soccer team needs to say that to the French police, not to the rebels. Seems to me the French national soccer team needs to shut the f*** up and learn how to beat Argentina in the World Cup. The insurrection is somewhat reminiscent of events in 2005 when two teens, Bona Traore and Zayed Benna, were electrocuted in a power substation while hiding from cops in Clichy-sous-Bois. It would appear that French police are still targeting non-white people. It appears the population of France is still not going for that. All of this comes on the heels of violent protests and clashes with police in France after President Emmanuel Macron used his executive powers to raise the retirement and pension age in France, a unilateral action that is questionable in its legality. So it would appear the people of France have a lot of good reasons to be enraged, and the government is doing all that it can to put a lid on this and project confidence, given that France is hosting the Summer Olympic Games next year and wants to rake in the tourism dollars, which is kind of hard to do if hotels are in the dumpster fire zone. I think France is the perfect anecdote for proving something I have said many times, that any hierarchically structured government system is, at its heart, fascist. France's Emmanuel Macron, as a former self-professed socialist, now centrist, a lefty liberal, about as far left as you get on today's world stage. He's in the same wheelhouse with leaders of Iceland or Belgium or Denmark, probably to the left of Bernie Sanders in the U.S. He's at the opposite end of the political spectrum from where we would traditionally position someone of the fascist ideology. But when it comes down to it, even lefty liberal socialists are fascist. They care more about the preservation of the state than they care about the preservation of its subjects. It's mind over matter. The state doesn't mind. Its subjects don't matter. Macron ignored all the rules and laws, and he exercised power to do something incredibly undemocratic, raising the retirement age even though the entire population opposed it. The kind of autocratic move you would expect from Trump or Italy's former Prime Minister Berlusconi. Then, in response to the outcry over illegal police violence, Macron, with his eye on Olympic tourism dollars, has turned France into a police state, locking up tens of thousands who have the righteous indignation to stand up against government injustice. Which proves what I've said all along. Even socialists are fascists. Socialists are fascists, Democrats are fascists, Republicans are fascists, and of course, fascists are fascists. They only differ in degrees. But when the power of the state is threatened or even seriously questioned, they all don the jackboots and get to cracking skulls in defense of the government, at all costs, even if it means waging war on the people, which is what the nation-state of France is currently doing. I would suggest to you that from an anarchist analytical perspective, it matters not the relative positioning of the soft fascist compared to the hard fascists. Macron's pseudo-socialist lip service certainly didn't matter to Nahel. So the people of France have it right. They don't need someone to explain to them that what they experience is oppression. The sooner we all follow the lead of the French insurrectionists and tip over the cop cars in the names of everyone the cops have killed, the closer to freedom we will all be. There are only two solutions, matches and gasoline. And the French soccer team's pleas notwithstanding, if political violence is not the answer, you're asking the wrong question. This is anarchist prisoner Sean Swain from the Super Duper Uber Mega Ultra Hyper Turbo Multi Maxi Max in Youngstown, Ohio. If you're on the streets of France, you are the resistance.
You can still write Sean at his new old new again address at Sean Swain number A243205 OSP Youngstown 878 Coitesville Hubbard Road, Youngstown, Ohio 44505. You can find his past writings, updates on his case, hear his past audio, find out how to get his books, plus ways to contribute to his legal defense fund at seanswain.org.
Donate to AAP. stop the MVP. Donate to AAP. We weren't the ones committing the crimes. We were only standing up to the injustice of pipelines. So when you think MVP, think of us sitting in a tree, trying our best to be free. This pipeline will never be. When we think happiness, think of work sites all a mess. Excavators tipped on their heads, Steve's face turning bright red. To stop the MVP.